This is Black Market Leadership, the underground resource for disruptors and status quo breakers.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Black Market Leadership. I hope everyone watching YouTube can see my smile because we have a fantastic episode. I am so excited. We have Dr. Michael Vlahos. Did I say it correctly, Doctor?
Yes. Well, there are many ways to say it, and all of them are correct.
Well, I tell you, people, I was introduced to Dr. Vlahos. We both know Colonel Doug McGregor, and one night I'm on Twitter and I'm looking through all my tweets of all these amateur historians, and they're all saying, you got to watch this interview with Colonel McGregor and this Dr. Vlahos. And I watched was it 4.5 hours, Doctor? It was amazing.
Probably more like 3, but it sounds even more heroic if it's 4.5.
Okay, I remember there were 3 parts, and if I'm right, you ran your time out in the library. They're like, get out! You guys got to stop your conversation.
Yeah, basically. Well, it was the Army Navy Club, so a lot of rules, right? You know all about that.
Oh yes, rules. Yeah. I don't like rules, and I think one of our the guy we're going to talk about today, Hernan Cortes, I think he like making his own rules. So before we get into this, people, I have a question. I love strategy. I've always studied strategy, and Dr. Vlahos, and you've heard from the bio prior to this episode, has taught strategy, knows strategy in and out. So, Doctor, my understanding of strategy as a layman is strategy really is seeing the whole, and it comes from the word strategos. Strategos being an ancient Greek general, Athenian general, or just Greek general. Right. But I think people think of when you say strategos, you think, okay, here's a general who's responsible for just winning the battle. But it's more than that. It's mustering the soldiers, selecting the leaders, the planning, the logistics. What happens if you have 2 battles? How do you get there? How do you come back? It's the whole picture.
It is, and it's equivalent, really. Strategos in Greek is equivalent to the commander of a Roman army, which is, you remember from the days of the Roman Republic, Roman armies were commanded by a consul. A consul was the elected, there were 2 consuls elected every year, and they basically were the leaders of the Roman city-state. Then later on, as an empire, the idea of imperator, from which we get the word emperor, and proconsul, dealt with a governance of conquered territories that had been incorporated into Rome. So any Roman general, and then later Byzantine general, Byzantines called themselves Roman, but they used the word strategos instead of imperator. And they had to be a jack of all trades, and they basically had to be able to exercise administrative and political authority, as well as being a military leader. And it's a wonderful word because it uncovers the fact that strategy is a complete a work of art, which requires a palette of many colors, many capabilities on the part of the leader. And strategy itself, thus, is a holistic process, like taking a palette of colors and creating painting. Or maybe even better analogy might be opera, where you have music, sometimes ballet, certainly you have drama, and you have a theater, and you have set design, and it all comes together into a kind of alternative reality. So the way I would approach strategy would never be to read a definition, which is a terrible rabbit hole, like the word terrorism, trying to define something like that. It's mostly misdirection and gets you nowhere. What strategy really is the alternative, the construction and sustainment, and it's the complete directorial approach to an alternative reality, because war is this kind of work of art, bloody work of art that is created for a particular task. And it's a reality that exists only for the war. And the entirety of the war thus has to be created by the auteur. It's like creating a movie. And certainly wars are mostly remembered today as movies, for that matter. And that exactly is what war is. So it's not normal life, it's an alternative reality that exists for a time. So the strategist is the person who is the auteur trying to direct that enterprise.
So you gave two examples. A third example I would suggest is, let's talk about a Spanish conquistador who has a particular aim, something to achieve in the future, to deliver a huge prize for his king. A king, by the way, audience, who, as you'll learn, doesn't know who he is and doesn't know what he's doing until years later. This man has to go out and achieve this huge prize, ultimately to create a new Spain. And in doing so, he has to balance the political dimension. He has to ensure that he's in an alliance with his king, and to make allies on the ground. The legal dimension, to make sure what he's doing is legal, that he can actually ensure that this, as you'll see, the Spanish don't come and arrest him during his conquest, as supplies keep coming in. The spiritual dimension, to keep his people motivated to conquer this alien force who are sacrificing others. And the military dimension, how do you take this city, this beautiful city, which we now know as Mexico City, as Tenochtitlan? How do we take that in full tack and give it to our king, while the circumstances and everything is changing as we go? That's why I wanted to talk to you, because when I read this, I see Cortes as really a fascinating strategic leader. And I don't mean strategic leader as someone sitting in the Pentagon in DC. I'm seeing as a man who takes a force, who has a goal, and who is balancing all the different dimensions, as you said, all the different colors, to achieve that final artwork. But the difference is, he has to go through reality. He has an image in his mind of what success looks like, and he has to start here. And there's this big gap. And for the audience here, that gap is usually called the fog of war. There are a lot of things which are going to happen, which he is not anticipating. How does he go through that? So in that sense, would you consider Cortes a strategic leader?
Well, I'd go a lot farther than that. I think he was early modernity's first master of the universe. And master of the universe is a term that really took the literary world by storm, because it was the hook in Tom Wolfe's Bonfire of the Vanities. And the master of the universe in his book referred to these financial wizards who could make anything happen. And so essentially what Cortes did was not so dissimilar from what Alexander did, what Julius Caesar did, or Horatio Nelson, or Napoleon. They created the world that they wanted to inhabit and to lead. And in that sense, all of those men are the polar opposite of the general officer, flag officer class in the United States military today, who have that sort of conceptualization, that sort of almost messianic vision of the world that they will literally sculpt around themselves. That is anathema in the American military. So the greatest generals in the American military have been men like Robert E. Lee, who were totally bound by duty and loyalty. And those who get off the reservation are few and far between. Mostly our first and greatest general, George Washington, because he was a British colonel. Remember that. And second after him would be probably Andrew Jackson, who did the same kind of, I'm going to go out and build this world. And he may come the closest to this sort of figure. And it's important that, with the exception, say, of Alexander and maybe Caesar, these other men were all from the petty nobility, as it's commonly termed. You know, they were not really aristocrats. They were of the lesser gentry. And thus they had to make their way in a world where they did not have the silver spoon, they did not have the leg up, they did not have the cushion, et cetera, et cetera. So they had to go out and make it happen, and they had to take risks. And so this capacity to take risks on one hand, and yet to have a kind of exquisite sense of what can be achieved and what it will take to achieve it, and how to play people, is extremely important, if not central. In other words, all these men were extremely charismatic. They were able to take whatever they had available there, whether it was in the form of people or resources or social permission, and they just ran with it. And what's so powerful about Cortes is that he was always a threat to the controlling types who had social rank and privilege, like the governor of Cuba, for example, Velasquez, who hated Cortes and tried to have him crushed. And he was outfoxed in several ways by Cortes. And it's that capacity to have enemies and yet to get around them without being crushed is another skill, for that matter. And the greatest skill of Cortes was not necessarily as a tactician, but really his capacity to build coalitions, because the only way he could possibly have conquered all of Mesoamerica, which is the entire culture area that is now modern Mexico and Central America.
We're talking 25 million people, right?
Oh, yeah. Well, it was very large. I mean, okay, for context, Mesoamerica was at least 5 times the population of Spain itself. And Spain itself was not the largest and most populous nation in Europe. It was poor. And it was France with 20 million people that was the dominant force on the continent. And yet, for a period beginning with Cortes and Carlos V, who was both the King of Spain and the Holy Roman Emperor, Spain was able to dominate Europe for 150 years. You know, from 1520s to 1660. And that's impressive. And, you know, you have to ask yourself, well, was it just Cortes, or was there this larger spiritual quality of energy within Spain itself that drove them relentlessly to achieve the things they did? I mean, they created a whole new world. I mean, they called it a new world, but then they made it a new world. I mean, the entire world of the Hispanic Americas is a remarkable achievement. Whatever unpleasantness attended the creation of that world, it is today a fantastic achievement. And so Spain and Portugal essentially had circumnavigated the world and founded a giant empire. Empire so large that Philip IV in the 17th century was popularly known as El Rey Planeta, the planet king. It was true because, you know, during this period of Philip IV in the 17th century, actually 16th to 17th, for about 80 years, Spain and Portugal were joined. So Spain literally had a globe-spanning empire for that period. It was a remarkable achievement for such a small, impoverished place. And of course, it's even more astonishing to try and figure out how they did it, because Cortes never had more than about 1,500 men-at-arms, if that, often much less. And Pizarro, when he took the other great civilization, the Inca Empire in Peru, he had even fewer. And so, you know, it's a very interesting mix of Spanish guts, you know, what the French call crin, and on one hand, and on the other, there was tremendous fragility and susceptibility in the both the Aztec and Inca empires that rendered them extremely brittle, and a single blow landed properly undid them both.
So okay, you said I picked out three essential things I've been wanting to ask you, and you said them, but I'm going to ask you in this order though. We'll start with one. Question one is the role of religion. Now, this is the Renaissance period. What I'm about to ask you, I am not to suggest that they did not take their religion seriously. I know they did, but is it fair to say that their religion acted not just as an element of purpose, but it gave them a moral fuel, almost like a moral answer, or as a catalyst for them to go out and demonstrate and use that energy?
It was a crusade. And a crusade doesn't necessarily indicate a Christian assault or impetus. It was true also of Islam. The great Islamic conquests took place within a span of from 636 to about 711. So that's not very long. You're talking the 3 generations. And the caliphate spanned everywhere from, the Atlantic Ocean and Spain all the way into India. And that was done in 70, 80 years. So that kind of impetus is important to understand, because great things have been done with that kind of, really that kind of spiritual drive. And for Spain, there was literally no break from the world that they had known since that special date that I already mentioned, 7/11. 7/11 was the great battle in which the Moriscos, as the Spanish called them, the Moors, the Arabs really at that point, defeated the Visigothic kingdom and took all of Spain, with the exception of the most northern strip of Spain. And so Spain, from 7/11 until 1492, okay, that's 800 years.
Wow.
They had to claw their way back from being with their backs to the sea on top of a range of mountains in Galicia and Leon, and push all the way down until they reached, Gibraltar, and they did it. And the 1492 date is the year that the last emirate fell, Granada. And once that was done, Cortes followed as well. Columbus was also 1492. Cortes was conquering Spain by 1522. I mean, New Spain by 1522. So you have this burst of energy. And I have to say it was mirrored also by the Portuguese, because they had, in the 15th century, started inching down the coast of Africa, and they first were able to seize the Cape Verde Islands and then work their way all the way down to the Cape of Good Hope and break out on the other side, which they did in 1494. So it's all happening at the same time. And then on one hand, the Portuguese under Alfonso de Albuquerque, were defeating the Muslim fleets in the Indian Ocean and taking these little trade cities and stations and islands, spice islands. And the Spanish at the same time were taking over all of Latin America. And of course, the Portuguese also started settling in Brazil as well. So you have this incredible explosion. And you can imagine that Cortes, with just a band of men that he personally recruited in Cuba and then took to the coast and started capturing little towns like Tabasco, founded Veracruz, and then moved into, there was a passage, a kind of trek or odyssey made by this little band all the way eventually to Tenochtitlan, Tlatelolco. Oh, excuse me, Tlatelolco. It's a tough. These glottal languages are not easy. So the point is that this was just as amazing, say, as the conquest of Alexander the Great. Although he had a much larger army and was dealing with a well-established superpower, what makes Cortes's achievement all the more fantastical is that he did that not only with a tiny, band of armed men, but he also was able to somehow confront and defeat and make, and this is the critical point, coalition alliances with many of these nations in Mesoamerica without any understanding in advance of what it was. I mean, it was a completely alien world, and it was very much, I've mentioned this before, very much like cowboys versus aliens.
Yes.
Cortes is the cowboy, the caballero, and that's important because he's on a horse, and the horse is very important to the unfolding of the story. But the fact that you have this caballero who is confronting literally aliens, people who not only of which he knows nothing culturally, but who also are engaged in social practices, religious practices, which are like those out of hell through the eyes of a Spaniard.
Right.
I mean, they represent something fiendish and demonic that must be overthrown. The people must be redeemed and uplifted through Christianity. And of course, what you have here is you have a tremendous personality, but you also have a spirit of the age in Spain, which, not so unlike the Caliphate, has a kind of crusading mission that drives it on. And it's really interesting because not only did the Spanish spend 800 years crusading down the Iberian Peninsula, but they were also well connected to the actual named crusades that were taking place in the Eastern Mediterranean, because a third of Spain, the eastern third, called Aragon, was a separate kingdom during this period of the Reconquista in the Middle Ages. And Aragon had expanded to the point where half of Italy was Aragonese. And they also had soldier companies that were wandering around fighting the Turks. And this was in the 13th century. So there is a deep and abiding connection. And lest we forget, the Spanish empire of Carlos V, which had Spain, and Spain had all the Netherlands and half of Italy and more. And also there was the Habsburg Empire, which controlled the whole Holy Roman Empire, which was literally the entire center of Europe, east of France. And this great power was engaged in a long struggle with the Turkish Sultanate, the Ottoman Empire, as we call it. And the Ottoman Empire included about 20 modern countries in its compass. It was just gigantic. And one of them, of course, was Ukraine, which is interesting as well.
Wow.
So these two great powers were had locked horns in the 16th century. And it culminated in a great sea battle in 1571 at Lepanto. And so you have this deep connection with a crusading mythos that started in the 1099, or no, actually, I think it was 1097. And then Jerusalem was taken in 1099. That was the first crusade. But you had that crusade in the east, and then you had the crusade in Spain. So the Spanish were just, they were based, as they say today. You know, they really focused on. So, you know, when after Cortes had conquered New Spain, as he renamed the world of the Mexica, 12 Franciscans arrived in Mexico, and they were called the 12 Apostles. So there was this, there was a certain amount of arrogance here, but it's also a complete belief, deep conviction that Spain was the cutting edge of God's plan for the world, and they certainly took that the distance, shall we say?
I remember years ago. I just got to add one thing to what you said about I guess the Spanish culture of rising, of, I don't know, that spirit of conquest, getting that energy out. I remember listening to, it was from an Ayn Rand Institute audio tape, and I heard a live reading of the Song of Roland. And I was like, oh my Lord, what is it? It's an amazing poem. And reading about Cortes, I think the conquistadors would always have in the back of their mind, the Roland, Don Quixote. They had all these stories of heroes, and heroes do great things. And again, that energy, that catalyst pushing them forward.
Well, I mean, if you look at the literary dimension of this entire experience, Miguel de Cervantes, for example, fought at the Battle of Lepanto that I just mentioned, and he lost a hand. So, I mean, he certainly gave his all, well, not quite his all. He certainly sacrificed for España. And it's interesting that the great literary work that came out, there were two great literary works that emerged from Cortes's conquest. One is, you know, La Conquista de Nueva España by this fantastic guy, Bernal Diaz del Castillo, who wrote it when he was like 90 years old and had a kind of faraway hacienda, or what they called an encomienda, a plantation out in the backwoods of Guatemala. And so it's a wonderful read, and it reads like the Odyssey and the Iliad all rolled into one.
It is. It's absolutely, sorry.
No, you just get this incredible literary outburst. The second great chronicle of the conquest was made by the Mexica, the Aztecs. It's called the Florentine Codex, and it was finally translated by Father Sahagún in the 1560s or 70s. And so we have parallel records or narratives of this fantastic experience. And it's tremendously complex, because if you were to go, say, to Wikipedia and just read the conquest story, it just doesn't come across as anything major.
Right.
But say we were to compare it to Julius Caesar's conquest of Gaul, you know, that was pretty straightforward. It was horrible. And in fact, Caesar killed many more as a percentage of the population of Gaul, which is France and the Netherlands together, and Switzerland. He did that, and it took him 9 years, and he did the whole thing simply to create the political momentum so that he could be the next leader of Rome. And he did it, you know, it's like he killed 1 million Gauls so that he could get a book out of it. De Bello Gallico is his book, because the book was his ticket to the campaign to take over the Republic. But that's so different, because the Romans and Gauls had been jostling together culturally for centuries. In fact, the Gauls had been the ancient enemy of Rome. They'd captured Rome at one point, and they were hated. They were like the comparable to the Russians today, for example. So that's pretty, that's all within the orbit of what was known and what people did. But Cortes, landing with his small band, couldn't get, he did something unbelievable. He was able to make friends in the most powerful way in terms of coalitions that would be willing to give their all to destroy the Mexica, because the Mexica were hated. And so you had all of these other nations there that were just itching to get revenge. Because one of the things the Aztecs would do is they would fight these flower wars. Mm-hmm. In other words, their idea of strategy was to fight a battle to take prisoners. And so, for example, all their weapons were designed around wounding and not killing. And they were also geared toward ritual encounters, which could then be celebrated through later ceremony. And the ritualized battle was all about pomp and display. If you've ever looked at Aztec warriors, the artistic effort that went into their panoplies is beyond belief. It's so incredibly over the top, beautiful, but also designed with the religion of the Aztecs in mind. And the celebratory ceremonies that would follow these flower wars involved literally the blood sacrifice of hundreds of thousands of people. Not all at once, but over the course of a year, you'd have, I don't know, tens of thousands of people with their hearts ripped out by priests, and the blood would come cascading down the steps of the pyramid.
Their limbs eaten by the priest. I mean, that was a part. You cut the heart out. You cook and eat the limbs, I believe.
Well, one of the problems with Mesoamerica, and I don't know where thinking stands on this among anthropologists and academicians today, but it is known that there was a shortage of protein in Mesoamerica. So there have been some theories, I don't know how well regarded they are at this point, that anthropophagy, meaning cannibalism, had a nutritional side as well as a ritual side. Now, that's a bit of an aside. The truth of the matter is, though, that Spanish visitors encountering, the interplanetary Spanish visitors encountering this form of religious ceremony could only have reacted one way. And the worst part of it isn't just the sacrifice. It's the fact that priests would skin people and wear their skin. There's a terrible story in one of the academic volumes I have in which one of the nations that has to make peace with the Aztecs says, well, we want your daughter, the princess. We want her to marry Huitzilopochtli, which was the dominant Aztec god. Well, marriage, when the king did it, and when he came back, he saw a priest wearing the skin of his daughter. So this is the state, in like one sentence, this is the state of international relations in Mesoamerica. And they were like, these were nations. They were like 30 of them or more that were important nations. And it wasn't that difficult for Cortes under these circumstances to enlist their assistance and form an alliance. And it was really quite remarkable that he could culturally do this. And part of the way he did it, of course, was by getting together with a slave girl known as Malinche now, who became who was I think she was aristocracy that had been captured and was now had the status of a slave, but nonetheless, she became Cortes'
translator.
Yeah, but also concubine, and then essentially wife. And Cortes had a son by her, and his first son, and he is now understood to be the first mestizo in Mesoamerica. So it's kind of interesting to see a way in which this entire experience can be interpreted as something amazing, as well as something with terrible side effects and consequences. But the fact was, if we really get down to it, that the Mexica were operating in a way that was not sustainable. The Aztec Empire was not going to make it. And in fact, there was a kind of cultural instability built in to the entire tapestry of the Mesoamerican world, because the fall of the classical age and its seat at Teotihuacan, the great temple city, led to a period of instability. And the Aztecs, as you know, came into power overthrowing their predecessors, the Toltecs. And it was a very unstable situation. And so it was going to have to be resolved. In fact, you could compare it to the Greek world before Philip of Macedon, Alexander's father, came in and conquered all the warring Greek city-states and created a unity that had never existed before. And so there was something was going to happen. But it's interesting how the cowboys versus aliens aspect also worked in Cortes' favor.
You mentioned something. Okay, so we've talked about the Spanish, and we're talking. And by the way, for the audience, when the doctor says Mexican and Aztec are basically that's the same. Mexican is, and for the audience, Mexican is spelled, it's Mexican. So if you spell Mexican, that's how you pronounce it. So if you look at the Mexicans, Tenochtitlan, their capital is it's a major city. In I believe the Spanish would even call it the Venice. It's the Venice of New Spain with the waterways. It's enormous. People go on the internet, look at it. It's enormous, and it's really a citadel. I mean, to me, it seems like a massive citadel surrounded by water that has these walkways that lead you to the city. So it's controlled access. And you mentioned how very much like the Greek states, they have conquered a satellite of other cities. And if I remember right, their economy, it's mostly a barter economy, which they bring in a lot of they bring in a lot of goods from the states which owe them. So the reason I'm bringing this up is you mentioned earlier that Cortes, one of his main strengths was creating coalitions. I'm going to throw this out there, Dr. Strategist. It seems to me, if you're asking me, what's the center of gravity for the Spanish and the Mexicans, I'd say it's actually coalitions on both sides. The fact that Cortes can create coalitions because the majority of his forces are Mexicans.
Oh, vast majority.
Vast majority. And the Aztecs, Tenochtitlan, the heart of the Aztecs, their lifeline are come from outside, from all the satellites. And what Cortes does is bring in the people who don't like the Aztecs. They fight them, they overtake them, and they start isolating the actual capital. They actually literally isolate it in the end. Am I close to the truth here? Or?
Well, I mean, center of gravity is is a difficult term because there are often more than one centers of gravity. But the problem with city-centric states or nations is that the fall of the city is pretty much the fall of the regime. And city-states are vested in their city. I mean, Venice, for example, you mentioned Venice has survived for centuries because it was impossible to assault. Likewise, the Byzantine Empire survived the onslaught of the Avars, the Slavs, the Arabs, the Pechenegs, the Cumans, et cetera, because it was a citadel that could not be breached. It was like Helm's Deep, for example, and the center of gravity in that sense was Tenochtitlan, but the center of gravity in terms of deciding the war was clearly in the coalition. I mean, it'd be like saying, had the Wehrmacht taken Moscow, that would have been a center of gravity. But the other center of gravity was the coalition and the Lend-Lease aid that was really decisive in allowing the Soviet Union to survive. So I don't know what kind of terms you'd use, but I think that is essentially the dynamic at play. At the same time, in the Franco-Prussian War, Paris was definitely a symbolic center of gravity. And when Paris fell, the war was basically not sustainable anymore. However, it was really the armies and their capacity to, I mean, when the the Germans, the German Confederation basically captured both French armies at Metz and Sedan, that was the hinge. And so you have to see these things operating together. I think the city begins to represent the spiritual center of the nation. And so the fall of that city is pretty much irretrievable. We even saw that in the Civil War, that the South was still holding out until Richmond fell. And so, the city keeps you going because it's the heart of the nation, but it's always in strategy. It's about the armies. And when you lose those, you're then holed up in a city, and it's an end game, and that's what happened clearly in Mesoamerica.
To me, there's a certain irony, because I remember I think Clausewitz said, when you attack a civilized nation, you go for the capital. When you attack an uncivilized nation, you go and kill the army, the chieftain and the army. And yet here, the strength is really, it seems to me, the strength with the advanced we talked about the earlier, and I'm going to ask you about this, the role of technology. Who's the most technological prowess? It's the Spaniards. But as you see, I'll just bring it up. One of the major battles of this is called the Battle of Otumba. And I think there's 800 Spaniards and maybe 1,000 and Spaniards, by the way, who are probably half strength. They're wounded, they're tired. They have 17, 18 horses, and they have 1,000 Mexican allies, and they're surrounded by an army to 10 to 20,000, and yet they win.
Right.
But to the Spaniards, if you take the uncivilized Aztecs, they have, it seems to me like you said, their spiritual source, the crux of all their activity is in the capital. To me, it's almost like a mismatch. But let's talk about the role of technology, because I think the average person would say, well, obviously the Spanish won. They had guns, right?
Sort of. I mean, I think they had more crossbows, arbalests, than they had, arquebuses.
Right.
So, and they had a very tiny number of horses, but of course, now there are millions of horses in the Western Hemisphere, thanks to the Spanish. But when they arrived, they were shocking on horseback, because they were like some mythical creature almost.
Giant deer. I think they call them giant deers, didn't they?
Okay, they might have, yeah. I think of centaurs, of course, but I mean, yeah, the problem for the Aztecs was not necessarily the weapons. It was like three problems that they had. The weapons gave an edge, since most of them were swords, if you pardon the expression, for the Spanish. But the weaknesses, the brittleness of the Aztec regime, and the fact that it was not really, I mean, it was facing rebellions everywhere from other subservient satellite nations. And that was one problem. The other was the belief system of the Aztecs themselves. And there were these, if you look at the Quetzalcoatl literature, which really begins with the last period of the classical age, and you have what's known as the Topiltzin Quetzalcoatl, and the whole sacred literature talked about the return of the Topiltzin Quetzalcoatl, and his return would, in the Aztec sacred literature, mean a full circle in which Quetzalcoatl would overthrow Huitzilopochtli, who was the main Aztec deity. And so Moctezuma was frozen, petrified in fear that the prophecy of sacred literature was coming to pass. That made him, that basically, I think, immobilized his capacity to think clearly and try to get rid of Cortes early. And the time allowed Cortes to make to build coalitions, and that was important. The Aztecs, furthermore, didn't have, because they fought ritualized battles for prisoners, they were not in a position to adapt to Spanish techniques in battle. And in any event, they were fighting the other allies of the Spanish in the traditional way anyway. So it was it was hard. If you look, let's look at North America during the, say, French and Indian Wars period. There had been a lot of interaction between Indian nations and both the French and the British. And it was possible to utilize Indian allies within the European context of battle, and really unusually adaptable and competent commanders like Howe. That would be Black Dick Howe's brother, who was unfortunately killed in 1758, right before the great battle at Ticonderoga, Carillon, in which the British Army suffered just an enormous defeat. He had developed a kind of approach to warfare in the wilderness that exploited Indian tactics and was able to operate in a different way successfully. And some of that was picked up by American colonial regiments as well, and would pay off big time in the American Revolution for the U.S. But the Aztecs were not in a position to think about adaptation at all, because the war approach was so bound up in religious needs, and that really hobbled their capacity to effectively operate. I mean, they were later on in the war, nearing the end, able to conduct some effective ambushes against the Spanish, and the Spanish lost a large number of people, but it was it was not a balanced situation that the Aztecs could turn around. So, I mean, in modern warfare, adaptation happens quickly. The Russians, for example, adjusted to the introduction of HIMARS very quickly and figured out how to disperse all of their stockpiles, battle ready lockers, if you will, serving the artillery, so they wouldn't get wiped out by a single strike. And then they were able to start jamming and targeting and shooting them down. And that's just a current example, but that happens all the time in warfare.
I heard
saw the bazooka, and within months they had the Panzer Schreck, which was better than the bazooka. And it's just that happens all the time. But this gets back to the cowboys versus aliens. I mean, the aliens were disadvantaged in terms of adaptation, whereas the Spanish, I would argue, could adapt very quickly because of their long crusading combat against the Muslim Emirates in Spain. So the Spanish had more cross-cultural capacity. You saw this in the French and Indian Wars, where for the longest time, the French had the advantage because they were culturally more empathetic and were able to develop rather intimate relationships with the Indian nations, Algonquin, the Huron, et cetera, while the British weren't. And I think this might be due also to religious issues. I mean, we can get into that at some point, but the fact is that something about the medieval experience, I think, made the Spanish more adaptable and more single-minded, more focused, more able to plan, more able to adjust, not just tactically, but also to adjust culturally. And there was no capacity within the Mexica to do that.
You brought, okay, so as a lawyer would say, you opened the door, because I had this written down, the role of religion. And what's so fascinating to me is, even though the Spanish they're Christians, I mean, make no mistake, people, they're Christians, but at that time in the history of Christianity, the Catholicism had become influenced by St. Thomas Aquinas. And who, by the way, was influenced, if I'm right, Aristotle, who really was reality oriented. So you can have your religion, but you also have a reality. You have to adapt to a reality.
Right.
Where you could say the Aztecs were really Platonic. This world doesn't matter. What matters is the abstract. That's why when Cortes is fighting them, he's not fighting them on their calendar. You can't fight now. We have a wartime calendar. You can't be doing this. And Montezuma, as you said, gosh, what a character. He reads to be very, very timid, or such a fatalist that he lets the enemy into the capital. Yes. He lets this superior enemy, and they know of their fighting capabilities. He allows them because he believes the God's will be done. I guess that's one way of saying it. So that's one thing I've realized reading this, just how unadaptable the Aztecs were, and how Cortes really did roll the punches.
You could almost say that the Aztecs had deprived themselves of agency, because according to their cosmology and their belief system, they did not have agency. And at the same time, the world of now, the physical, pinch me world, was much less than the mystical, magical world out there beyond. And this is one reason that human sacrifice was embraced by those about to be sacrificed, as much by those wielding the obsidian blade. And the fatalism was more than fatalism. Fatalism is something that you can see in Buddhist and other religions, but even in Christianity and Islam. But this went way beyond that, and it's hard to really understand. And yet, there it is.
Doctor, I think of if there's one example in American history that at least I know of. I remember reading The Killer Angels long time ago, and the scene of day 3, with right before Pickett's charge. Longstreet's tells Lee, we can't do this. We can't do this. And what does Lee do? It seems like he gives up his free will. Just let God's will be done. Let him do it. everything will turn out good, ignoring the evidence. And I mean, that was my reading, but at least to me, that's an example of it.
Well, I think within the Christian tradition, fatalism can be a kind of permission where you say, oh, things have reached this point. So from here on in, everything is in God's hands. And it gives you a way out. Whereas among the Mexica, at least, nothing was in their hands, really. And they were at the mercy of this vision that they created for themselves. And there's also, I think, there was more cultural, what I'd call prehensility. It's like the whole German Fingerspitzengefühle.
Feeling of the battlefield.
Yeah, well, it's because I don't want to use the word empathy. It's a sense of what's
Intuition.
going on. What's going on in the other culture, because what you see remarkably in Latin America that you do not see in North America in terms of relations with the what the Spanish would call the indígena, the indigenous ones. You see a higher sense of compassion and ability to connect. I mentioned the French doing this in Canada. They would be much more intermarriage. So trappers in Canada would marry the First Peoples, as the Canadians say today, and that happened a lot. In fact, it became a kind of force within Latin America. So that's why Mexico today calls itself mestizaje. It's mixed. It's, we're not white and we're not Indian. We're mestizo. Mestizaje is actually the foundation of post-revolution political thought in Mexico. And you see this in two ways around the time of Cortes and after. One is the person of, and he's almost a counterpoint to Cortes, is Bartolomé de las Casas. And he became the defender and the, he wasn't a salvational figure, but he fought for the rights of indigenous peoples. And he was at the same time as Cortes, and he had tremendous influence and effect on things. And the whole mission system, for all of its problems, was still, I think, authentically a way not simply to civilize the conquered peoples, but to offer all of the spiritual framework that would uplift them. And this was a sincere and indeed a core element of the Spanish mission. And you can see that Franciscans and Dominicans and others were had this prehensility because you have Father Sahagún, who is translating all of the Aztec literature into Spanish. And how does he do that? I mean, he didn't go get a degree in anthropology or linguistics, but he did it, and a tremendous achievement. And it shows a deeper understanding of humanity. And the British and Northern Europe, the Protestant ethic is much more severe. I mean, if you look at the Puritans, even the Quakers, but certainly the Dutch Calvinists and others, they're very tough.
No free will, right? It's no agency.
Well, you have the key here, I think, is predestination, and the fact that there are the elect, who've already been saved, and then there are and so you see a very, very different kind of slavery as an institution and slave trading emerge in Northern Europe much more as an enterprise, whereas slavery is very different. There was huge amounts of slavery in pre-conquest Mesoamerica, and the Spanish made efforts after the conquest to pare that down as much as they could. I mean, there was slavery in parts of Latin America, but generally an effort was made to prevent that form of chattel slavery, which was so prevalent in the Protestant operations, that led ultimately to the Civil War. And you also had Cortes didn't enslave his allies when the war ended. They all became Spanish grandees. They became aristocrats. And the position socially of the indigenos did decline over time, but in large part, it was due to the collapse of population in Mesoamerica due to European diseases, that they were not like aliens. If you think about H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds, how was the invasion of the Martians stopped? Well,
That's right.
Well, the same thing happened in Mesoamerica, but it was terrible. And sort of, 80, 85, I don't even know. A majority of people died within a couple generations. And as a result, whatever social order had been regnant, had been in charge before the coming of the Spanish, was broken down. But even so, the Spanish acknowledged and protected to a degree the rights of the caciques, the local leaders. So they were still local leaders, and we all have to remember that Mesoamerica wasn't conquered in a day. I mean, Cortes conquered the Aztecs, but then there were many campaigns that were made in Central America and in the North, and in all of those campaigns, there was a really important element of the indigenous allies in the conquests that were made after. So I'm just looking here at a book that's called Indian Conquistadors, and it shows in the conquest of Michoacan or Oaxaca, Jalisco, Yucatan, Guatemala, Honduras. You've got all of these peoples here. You've got it's hard for me to read here. Tarascan, Tacleca. Oh, they're right here. There are at least 13 different nations that are contributing forces for the conquest of Mesoamerica. And so it's not a unitary, monolithic sort of conquerors and then the subjugated. It's much more like what the Romans would do. And if you became a Roman ally, that came with a lot of benefits. Mm-hmm. And even if you were defeated, if you submitted to Rome, then you could be embraced by Rome. You could be rewarded. You could become Roman. So, it's really in a long tradition. So there's this disruptive, chaotic event, the conquest. But there's also weird kinds of continuity and weird kinds of syncretism. I mean, one of the reasons that Catholicism was so successful in the Americas was that practices, rituals, and sacred objects and people, deities, were incorporated into the Catholic cosmology, so that people could find new Catholic names for the gods that were important to them, that sort of framed their life, and so this syncretism is very important, and it's exactly, by the way, what missionaries did in Europe itself at the end of the Roman Empire. So just one easy example is Easter. We talk about Easter, but that's not what it's called in the Mediterranean world, Pascal, the lamb. Why is it called Easter? Well, Easter was a mother goddess in Britain. And their rituals, their May Day rituals, so-called pagan rituals.
Yeah.
So you replace those pagan rituals with Easter.
Oh, wow.
So the whole Christian calendar incorporates, pieces of the world that preceded it. And,
Sure.
and there were thousands of shrines where there'd be little local gods. And they just replace the sacredness of the pagan shrine with, Mary, or
Right.
the tears were transferable, in other words.
I remember a long time ago, I read, I read 3 volumes of Fall and Decline of the Roman Empire by Edward Gibbon, and there's that famous, I think, chapter 14 where he gives the history of Christianity, to which he was called an atheist for even writing. It's a fantastic read. Last night, preparing for this, I think you'll get a kick out of this. Okay, I know who Neil Young is. I know some of the songs. I did not know that he wrote a very famous song called Cortes the Killer. No clue. I looked it up. It's one of the top 100 American songs. And in it, he describes Cortes as killing in large numbers these peaceful people called the Aztecs. And he talks about killing peaceful people who knew no war, and by the way, whose people purposely sacrificed themselves to the nation. It was so disingenuous that even Rolling Stone in the 70s had to come out and say, this is not historically accurate.
Well, that's the difference between the 70s and the woke world we live in today. Is today they'd say, oh, he's telling the truth. Any contrary view is misinformation and racism. So, we have come a long way too. But anyway, I think, the only people who were sort of peaceful like that, and they weren't totally peaceful, were the Caribs, in Cuba when.
Yes.
Yeah. But I mean, I think the story is so complex and interesting, and the role that Cortes played was not really of a conqueror, but more as a liberator. You can see him in that context. And the initial post-conquest Mesoamerica was more of a Roman kind of continuity. It was really the giant die-off, that horrible tragedy, which no one could have at that time could have foreseen. That it altered the balance, not of power, but just the social equilibrium that followed the conquest.
Do you have time for one more question?
Sure.
Okay. Now, it's my understanding that Clausewitz once said, that a strategy will take on the character of the person who designs it, of the leader. Would you call this the Cortes's campaign of, I think audacious, absolutely audacious. I think that's one way to put it. Would you say that that this campaign really shows who he was as a man, his particular traits and qualities as a leader?
Well, of course. And those traits and qualities include charismatic leadership and an ability to take advantage of opportunities. So that's where sort of intuition comes in. But also, the sort of belief in one's own destiny and a tremendous drive to make it. I mean, Cortes was the whole latter period of his life was, he made the conquests, and then everything began to go downhill after that, because he was not made viceroy of Nueva España, and he was never treated as he felt he should have been treated. Master of the universe, yes, but the establishment will always come get you, and the Spanish establishment did. And this is a problem for Caesar too, as his 50 stab wounds will attest.
Yes. To me, that's one of the biggest, I guess you call it ironies, or I don't know what would you call it, but the fact is this man conquered a new world. He really did. I mean, it just changed it. And militarily, a success, maybe even politically a success, but on a personal level, this man wanted recognition. He wanted, the king, here's my man Cortes, and it did not happen, despite the absolutely amazing feat that he orchestrated, that he personally orchestrated. I don't think anyone else, my reading of it, I don't think anyone has had the kind of character and just laser-like focus that he did.
Well, there are lots of figures like that in history. Some of them are absolutely, monstrous people. On the other hand, it says something about Spain that it could have produced this man, and not just one man, but you've got Magellan, obviously Columbus, although people say, oh, he's just an Italian, a Genoese, but no. Then you have endless, and including guys like Bartolome de las Casas. I mean, they're not just warriors, and they go on and on and on for this period of what you could call peak Spain, and a society that can create that kind of capacity among individuals has some heft to it in civilizational terms. And this is, of course, what worries me about the United States today. And I'm having taught at the Naval War College for some years, and taught at the graduate level about war and strategy all of my career since 1980. I see an America that is all about submission within its military, and it's all about playing it safe and building your lifestyle, building your status within the system. And a country that is so oriented toward enhancing status and wealth is going to be incapable of rising to real challenges.
Oh, absolutely.
And that's my great worry about America. And of course, with Spain, this is also kind of funny. Spain at the time of Cortes, obviously under Carlos V, was riding high, and even under his predecessor, his successor, Felipe II, it reached real heights. And then in the reign of Philip IV, and I mentioned that, when Spain was having greater and greater difficulty maintaining its dominance in Europe, there was a whole group of intellectuals in Madrid that were worrying about decline, and things were coming apart. And part of that speaks to the inevitable consequences of success. So over a century, Spain had been doing so great, but then it got into tremendous debt, and it could no longer handle enemies on every front. You can't make an enemy and fight a war with England, and then fight a war with France, and fight a war with the raging lion of the North, Sweden, and then an 80 years war with the Dutch, and then a crusade against the Ottoman Empire on three fronts. And frankly, that looks a lot like the U.S. today.
I was going to ask you. Yeah. You got you're everywhere. You're going bankrupt.
You've got a canary in the coal mine. When you have the intellectual class worried about decline and the end of empire, well, then maybe you should listen to them and look at what's going on. But the U.S. now is engaged. I mean, it has an elite that, a ruling class, better yet, that is solely about its own rank and privilege, social status, and above all, wealth. and doesn't care a thing for the people. And we have a military that looks good on paper, gauged by how much money we spend. But it's a what Mao would used to call a paper tiger.
Wow. Yes. Could you teach Cortes in the campaign today at the Naval Academy? Would they even allow this?
Well, I actually put together a proposal for an entire module, on a case study on Spain in the period of, again, Carlos V to Philip IV. And, several of my colleagues liked it, but got nowhere because I don't know. I mean, one thing that struck me about the War College was it was more about indoctrination than education. And the one thing it would not examine would be case studies that might reflect on the U.S. situation today.
Really?
You'd be surprised. So if you were in the Vietnam module, the questions, and you have to understand this is a nearly 200-page syllabus. It told you everything you needed to think about all of the case studies that were in the War and Strategy course. And in the question that leapt out in the worst possible way in the Vietnam module was, could the U.S. have won the war in Vietnam? And I just think, well, just asking that question is going to encourage people to come up with right think that is wrong. And the other one was, I would protest at our faculty meetings, and I'd say, well, we're doing the American Revolution, and we're doing it as an exercise in tub thumping and boosterism, like we're cheerleaders. And isn't it great? And the U.S., almost a miracle. We could have. We almost lost, and yet somehow we were able to turn things around. I said, wait, we shouldn't be looking at the colonial American side at all. We should be looking at the British.
How did they lose it?
And how did they make the wrong assessments at every turn? How did they do too little, too late? Like the Carlisle mission. How did they reach a point where they could lose two armies and have all the great powers in league against them at the end of the war? How did they manage that? And they didn't look at the British. They looked at how the Americans won, not how the British lost.
I read a book years ago, Command Culture, about the officer, German and American officer education, World War II, and me being a 6 years active duty officer, I always remember doing vignettes, little slivers of what could happen. But reading Command Culture by Jörg Muth, I think, Muth, the Germans would just say, hey, war starts or the battle starts, end it. And you do these war games, it could take days, but you didn't stop until you won. Where I just remember, here are the borders, comply with them, stay within the borders, don't think outside that box. And what would you do? And
that's interesting.
Doctor, I have friends I graduated with. Some now, I mean, many are retired of the Army. Some are some of these think tanks. They unfollowed me because I've talked to Colonel McGregor because I'm asking the questions you're bringing up. It's just talk about a story of cowboys versus aliens. I feel like I'm living in an alien culture.
Yeah, well, I mean, it is the fate of every super successful enterprise. You can say empire if you want, doesn't have to be an empire, but there's a reason that they begin to start arcing downward. And the reason is their success and the culture that's bred. And it isn't just a culture of being complacent or lazy. It's that generations that succeed the successful, victorious generations, after 3 or 4 generations, they feel entitled and they can't imagine anything but victory. I mean, the perfect example is the sanctions on Russia. They were going to crush Russia within a couple months. And instead, they came close to crushing us. I mean, we had to do a lot of fancy footwork to get that gas to Europe. Now, it's just an inability to assess, follow through, and to lose sight of how you got to where you are. And everything becomes ritualized. And people can only think of the ritual. And how am I going to do? Will I ever get FaceTime with the emperor? So it's not a good scene. And of course, the main thing is about later stage empires is that all of their energy goes into maintaining their belief in the status quo, their conviction that everything's cool. And so it means maintaining illusions. And the maintaining of illusions has been so remarkably exposed during this war against Russia. And it's really shaken me to the core to see that people can spend so much energy to successfully lie to themselves.
Yeah, yeah. Doctor, this has been a fascinating discussion. I got to tell you, I think it's one of my favorites. I was mesmerized. This is
not Plato. I mean, I can't compete with Plato.
Oh, this was great. This was great. Where can our listeners find you? You sent me some podcasts. I see you on Twitter, and you do writings every now and then, right? Where can we find you?
Oh, I'm a senior fellow at the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy. I have a couple articles there, and you can just Google me, and many articles will come up. And I'm also engaged. I'll be a senior editor at a new magazine called Aegon, and I should be appearing there very soon as well. Well,
I hope it goes great for you. That's a dumb joke. The audience is booing me right now. I can hear them.
I missed it. So don't worry.
Well, listen, again, thank you so much for doing this. This has been really, really exciting for me. I feel like I got energy for the day to actually do some other work now. So thank you.
Excellent. Wonderful.
And I look forward to seeing more of your writings, and let's stay in touch.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Take care.
Take care. Thank you, audience. If you like this content and want to hear other things like it, head on over to the website at blackmarketleadership.com. That's blackmarketleadership.com. There you can subscribe to the podcast, and you can even create a free members profile